everyone. For this presentation, we're going to be talking specifically about the brain ventricular system. So let's get started. First off, let's talk about what a ventricle is. You might be familiar with the term from the heart, where a ventricle is a chamber or a cavity that holds blood. The brain has something similar. Its ventricles are cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short. So just like the heart's ventricles are filled with blood, the brain's ventricles are filled with this fluid. Similar to the heart, the brain also contains 4 cavities, though in the brain, these are referred to as ventricles. You may already know that in the heart, the cavities are divided into 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Therefore, for the brain, we're going to have 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle, mainly because the lateral ventricles are considered to be ventricles 1 and 2. This means that the ones that come after are the 3rd and 4th ventricle. Moving on the next slides, we will see the characteristic of each of those ventricles. On this image, we can see the right and left cerebral hemispheres, and that's where we're going to find the lateral ventricles, one on each side. So from a sagittal view on the right, you can see they are the largest ventricles and they have a complex shape with lots of twists and turns. It might be tricky to see both the right and left lateral ventricles in each hemisphere on this sagittal view. But in the coronal view, it's clearer that there is a right lateral ventricle and a left lateral ventricle in each hemisphere of the brain. They're going to be separated by a thin membrane that's called the septum pellucidum, which can be seen right over here. And this space is going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which is actually made by the ependymal cells lining the cavity, and we will see those cells in the next few slides. And thanks to the septum pellucidum, the CSF in the right lateral ventricle stays separate from the CSF in the left lateral ventricle. And due to gravity, what will happen? Well, the fluid is going to move down, so it will eventually move down into the next compartment, which is the 3rd ventricle. The 3rd ventricle is a small space that's going to be filled with CSF, and it's located right in the center of the brain, as we can see from this coronal image. Imagine it as this tiny chamber that sits between the 2 halves of the brain, right in the middle over here. And it connects to the lateral ventricles, which are the larger chambers in the brain, and helps to move the CSF from them to the other parts of the brain. The CSF is important because it cushions the brain and it helps remove the waste. So the 3rd ventricle plays a key role in keeping the brain's fluid system running smoothly. On the sagittal view, we can clearly see the 3rd ventricle, and it actually looks like a bird's beak for me. See right over here? So this is how I'm able to differentiate it when I'm looking in the sagittal view. The 4th ventricle is the last ventricle of the brain, and it's located towards the back, between the pons and the cerebellum. So we can see it right over here on this sagittal view. Think of it as a small diamond-shaped chamber that acts like a sort of drain from the cerebrospinal fluid after it has flowed through the 3rd ventricle. And from here, the CSF moves into the central canal of the spinal cord. Therefore, the 4th ventricle helps keep the brain and the spinal cord cushioned and healthy by managing the flow of CSF. And since the 4th ventricle is posterior, we can't really see it on this coronal view. We would have to section it a little bit more posterior to be able to see the 4th ventricle. This is a model of the ventricles. Remember that the ventricles are spaces. So for you to be able to understand this model, you must think that this model was made by freezing a brain and removing the frozen CSF from the brain. So all of this gray area is actually CSF or frozen CSF in this example. So it's what is occupying the spaces of the brain. So it's important for you to understand this. On the left image over here, we can see the lateral ventricles. This would be your right lateral ventricle. This would be your left lateral ventricle. In the middle, we have a new space that's called the interventricular foramen, which makes sense as foramen is a space or a hole, and interventricular means between ventricles. So the interventricular foramen is going to be the connection between the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle, which is located underneath over here, but we can see it better on this lateral view right over here. Over here would be your interventricular foramen, and these are your lateral ventricles, and all of this would be your third ventricle. Remember the bird's beak that I talked to you about? So all of this is your third ventricle. Then on a posterior view, we can also see the lateral ventricles, and we can see the interventricular foramen right over here. So this would be the posterior part of the third ventricle. Now, from the third ventricle, CSF will go to the fourth ventricle. Remember how the fourth ventricle is posterior? So on the lateral view again, we can see the fourth ventricle moving posteriorly, and the CSF will go from the third to the fourth ventricle through this duct that's called the cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of the midbrain. So it doesn't really matter which term that you use. The other thing that I want you to notice is how there's a little hole over here, but remember that this is frozen CSF. So if there's a hole, it actually means that there's a structure right over here that does not permit CSF to circulate. And this structure is what we call the interthalamic adhesion. And we will see this on the next slide. But don't let this hole get you confused with the interventricular foramen. Because remember, all of this is frozen CSF. So all of this is a space that's filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. And let's identify the ventricles on the actual brain. Both of them are representing a mid-sagittal section. Let's look at this one that has the structures identified. For you to understand this, you should always remember that the ventricles are spaces. So this means that this structure right over here in the middle is the septum pellucidum. And the septum pellucidum is a structure that's separating, remember, the right and left lateral ventricles. Therefore, if I were to peel off the septum pellucidum, I would see on the other side a space representing the right lateral ventricle. Now, the left lateral ventricle is a little bit hard for you to understand, but if you can see that this structure here, which is called the corpus callosum, is a little bit more elevated than where the septum pellucidum is, then this means that this space over here that's in the air, popping up from the PowerPoint, would be your left lateral ventricle. So the left lateral ventricle, remember, it's going to be filled with CSF. From here, the CSF will travel to the third ventricle, which is right over here. And it travels passing through the interventricular foramen. So this little space right over here is your interventricular foramen. So from here, the CSF will go into the third ventricle, which is this space right over here. How do I know this? Well, see these two indentations over here. This is what will form the bird's beak. So there's CSF circulating right over here. This structure here in the middle is what we call the thalamus. And the thalamus has two hemispheres, and it's connected by this little ball over here that's called the interthalamic adhesion, which makes sense. Adhesion is like a glue, and this glue will hold the two hemispheres of the thalamus together. Therefore, from here, the CSF will go down into the fourth ventricle. Remember how I said that the fourth ventricle is between the cerebellum and the pons? And it's like a little triangular shape. So this is exactly what's being represented over here. And from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, CSF will pass through the cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of the midbrain. And moving down from the fourth ventricle, it will run through the central canal of the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord, and all of this would be the central canal. On the image to the left, we can clearly see those structures again and the spaces. So this would be your septum pellucidum. If this is your corpus callosum, then your left now lateral ventricle will be on the other side. From here, there's like a little space. This space is your interventricular foramen. See the bird's beak? So all of this is going to be your third ventricle, like a little space. Remember, this is the thalamus, and this is your interthalamic adhesion. From here, the CSF will come down through the cerebral aqueduct, circulate through the fourth ventricle, and then leave through the central canal and move down the spinal cord.